Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this African Studies class. And today we're going to be talking about African development with regards to theories, including resource cuts and some of the unique challenges that the African space faces. And going forward, I'm going to be sharing my screen, and you're going to be seeing it on the right-hand side corner uh, of this laptop, so you can follow the conversation as we move along. So bear with me as I start sharing the screen so that you can be in touch. But generally, some of the conversation here we're going to have regarding growth and particular emphasis on the uniqueness of each of these different countries, but also giving a general account of some of the things that have happened in the African space that you might understand or might have not understood. But I think it's just good to have a general understanding before we talk about some particular aspects of development. So here's some of the things that I want to talk about. One is on the patterns of growth. So what is often not known, or what is known, let me start with what's known, is the underdevelopment and the prevalence of poverty in the continent of Africa as a trope. But in reality, there's been economic growth, particularly starting from around the year 2000, that has been sustained in Africa. This hasn't been without challenges, but in general, there's been kind of an uplift of economic growth within the continent of Africa, which has uplifted a lot of people out of poverty. That needs to be discussed, and this growth has questions surrounding it with regards to whether the growth is related to development or if it hasn't led to development. Uh, Another thing that I wanted to emphasize in regards to African development is that these being this growth that the African space has experienced is mostly led by extractive industries, so minerals and raw materials export, rather than an expansion of manufacturing capability within the continent. So, yeah, while it does reduce some type of poverty, to really get rid of poverty within the African space will require massive industrialization, which I'm going to indicate hasn't happened for most of these countries. Um, there's also been a shrinking of African contribution in global trade, reducing it from about 15% in the 60s to about 3% in recent times. So that there has been efforts to generate a rebound with regards to African contribution, but we haven't seen those yet. A lot of it is still mostly the sale of raw material and domestic consumption as the sources of growth. So I want you to talk about that. So as you listen to this lecture, you want to be referencing some of those things that I've indicated as um, emblemic in what we're talking about. So one of the things is we want to talk, to understand is this idea of economic growth. Economic growth is a sustained increasement or enlargement of a country's GDP, which is gross domestic product. So you can measure economic growth by just looking at the number of GDP growth. It could be if a country had $1 billion and maybe next year they had $1.3 billion in terms of gross domestic product, which is a summation of all economic activities done, but with citizens and non-citizens alike in a particular economic space. Um, Economic growth is not synonymous with economic development. So economic growth mostly focus on uh, increased economic activity or government or private expenditure. Economic development is exhaustive. It includes the translation of economic growth in the upliftment of quality of life for the majority of people living in an economic space. And we measure economic growth with GDP, but economic development, we can measure with a series of things, including Human Development Index, access to education, healthcare, elongated uh, lifespans, and their ability to reduce infant mortality, death, and access to infrastructure, among other things. So in order to get from economic growth or extractive industry, you're going to have to undergo what we call structural transformation, which means the reallocation of a country's resources, mostly from primary extractive material to manufacturing, that will then employ quite a large swath of your population. If a society is able to get that, they are on the right track of economic development. And once you undergo this structural transformation, you get to a position called economic diversification. So the economic diversification shields you from some risks that come from booms and bust of a resource-driven economy. And very few countries have realized this. When you get to that spot, then there is a broader range of sources and production, employment, revenues, and expenditure that a country have resource to. And as we will see in most of the African countries, that really hasn't happened, and it's such a big crisis for many of these countries. Now, with the exception of South Africa, which has realized this last bit that I've talked about, and some countries in North Africa, most of the countries in Africa have not undergone the structural transformation that has led to diversification and industrialization. But another thing which is true about the African continent is the abundance of natural resources, much of which has to be mined and exported. And for the most part, most of the countries are involved in this kind of activities, with agriculture accounting for about 60% of the average production of GDP within the continent of Africa. We also have, if you compare that with the United States, the agricultural input, you find that most of the developed countries, in the United States, about 4% or less of the population are involved in agriculture, while in Africa it's a lot. So the number of people involved in agriculture without value addition is indicative of the level of development of a country. So here are some of the biggest economies in Africa. I have Nigeria at the top, Egypt follows slightly, Algeria is next, then Morocco, and then Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana. Ethiopia and Kenya kind of changed a lot, and that has changed from 1990 with regards to some of the key players there, but not much. It's kind of been stable that these countries have always been the largest economy, but for the longest time, it used to be South Africa, but now it's Nigeria and Egypt. Um, so that's just kind of interesting to see. Well, we move into the challenges of development. In nearly every African country, there are economic situations that have had vast consequences for the population, and these economic challenges then pave the way for uh, more adverse effects that can generate political turmoil. Um, and even as these countries improve their GDP, they are constantly dancing with this population growth that are growing very fast. So any subsequent growth in GDP is often eaten out by the rapid population growth. So a population conversation is needed to be had within the continent. And it's kind of like a very uncomfortable conversation as regard to whether you want to tell people not to have babies, or sometimes you need the babies to grow these economic activities. There's also kind of like a big push for regionalization, which is a need to expand the market capacities of some of the smaller economies in Africa with the creation of regional bodies, an African continental free trade agreement. But we know for evidentially is that some of these uh, ideas haven't translated into tangible outcomes yet. So as we move towards now looking at the numbers, to see important qualifiers of how these countries are doing. We're going to start with access to electricity here. Well, there's been a general increase in the access of electricity from about 33% to 40% in 2019. The share of electricity with regard to population has actually dropped. So here's again that population challenge. As you increase material and access, you have to also figure out how to increase population access to that as well. And you can see some of, other than North and Southern Africa, a majority of African spaces still struggle with electricity access. Let's look at literacy rates, which has increased. I mean, they met the Millennium Development Goal by around 2015, which means the majority of African children are having access to school education. Um, but one way to measure that is how many of these students have to pay for that. And when we look at that, we see countries with free high school education, which is separate from free primary education, which I think a majority of African countries have gotten to that. Or if they're paying it, then it's very minimal amount, which is not a strain on family budgets. But when it comes to high school education, we have select countries that have free high school education. And this includes South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, and Morocco, which has free education, including up to university level. So with the literacy rate, we got Equatorial Guinea at 95% and 19% in Niger, which is the lowest literate country in the continent. Now, with regard to urbanization, as we read in class, most of African urban spaces are not the biggest spaces with regards to population density, although that is changing rapidly fast. We see some of the biggest cities that are expected to grow include Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, Kinshasa, Luanda, Addis Ababa, Abidjan, Dakar, Lagos, and all that. Those cities are growing hugely and transforming the nature of life from a rural-based economy to urban oriented economies. And as of now, we got cities like Kinshasa, Lagos, and Cairo, Johannesburg, some of the biggest cities with very important economic spaces for the countries that are not only the countries, but all the regional areas that they are inhabited. So the cities are really important, but only 43% of Africans city residents live in places that will constitute as a city, measured through like about 1 million people and over. So how about internet access? This is an interesting one. Since we are in a rapidly globalizing economy, we want to measure access to internet. And as of 2018, the country with the most access to internet was South Africa again. Ivory Coast was second, and third was Morocco, followed by Tunisia, Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria. So it's not only access to internet that is being measured, but access to high-speed internet and with relative cost that's friendly to the users. And those are the numbers. And in the 21st century, access to internet is very important. What about life expectancy? When you measure life expectancy, um, you realize that the average life expectancy in Africa has shot rapidly. It's now averaging between 63 years for men and 66 years for females. The average life expectancy global was 71 for males and 75 for females by 2021, which means that there has been an upsurge in the quality of life overall in Africa, but there is still Africa is still left behind comparatively with regard to other countries. So some of the things that affect high quality life expectancy include HIV and AIDS, which can reduce the life expectancy of a population um, fast. But as access to medication increase, so is the access uh, to elongated lifestyle. So what about Human Development Index? If you see this global map, you look at the HDI index, which is high among some countries in South America, but mostly in Northern America, Australia, Western Europe, and parts of the Soviet and former Soviet Republic. But with regard to Africa, the highest quality of life is found in the southern parts of Africa, northern parts of Africa, and parts of East Africa. Mostly here you see Central Africa and Kenya there with a more greener space. But a majority of countries super light green, which means the quality of HDI access isn't as formidable as you'd like it to be. Those are just the facts as they are in 2021. Um, so now the next part of this conversation is going to be talking about challenges with regards to African development. And I'm going to talk about three of them. There could be many that I could focus on, but I want to talk about the resource costs, the population boom, and governance. So now, let's talk about the first one, which is the resource cost. Now, the resource cost is a paradox, and some people have said it's often overblown and it's not really reflective of really what's happening. But in general, African countries are brimming with natural resource endowment, which they have a lot of. I mean, they keep on finding more. We have diamonds, oil, cobalt, but the continent suffers from this cause of the presence of these resources because it doesn't lead to the increased quality of life or economic growth. So the resource cost means that the abundance of resources can hinder economic growth. So rather than a blessing, it becomes a cost for the countries that get them. So you will be excited if a country has oil and you're like, oh, our quality of life is gonna increase. We're gonna live like the Emirates, we're gonna live like Dubai. But then you realize that as you get that oil, it sets up a series of events that can lead to turmoil, underdevelopment, and other risks that were not foreseen before. Now, how does the resource cost manifest? It can happen through several ways. It can happen through what we call the Dutch disease. It's not like a disease, like a real one, but it is when a resource wealth lead to an appreciation of currency that limits economic activity because it discourages people from buying product from that country or exporting, makes it hard for the countries to export its materials to other countries due to an appreciated currencies that makes its products extremely expensive. I don't think that's really common within the African space of the 20 years, especially in the neoliberal age where currency depreciation has been lopsided towards the disadvantage of African countries. But in the last two are the most common, which I want to highlight. When a resource revenue are increased in an environment without limited institutional framework, there tends to be a high rate of corruption due to institutional frameworks that cannot capture these corrupt practices. This is one of the biggest challenges of a resource cost, is the inability of the country to take these cash flows that come rapidly into the economy as a result of the oil or any other natural resource. But the other one also is related to conflict. So due to this entrenched culture of corruption and the feeling of being left out, the consequence of a resource cost and corruption is always conflict. So you have armed groups, militias coming out uh, that create on existing grievances, but perhaps talking about the inability of one ethnic group to access resources that belongs to the country, and other people will be like, okay, this group of people, group A, have captured the state. They're mining the oil and the diamond, and they're leaving us out. Now, as a response to what we call autochthony, which is the rule of the native, we're going to organize ourselves and galvanize and march towards the capital to supplant Group A from occupying space. So Group B organizes a militia. It recruits a lot of people, sometimes child soldiers, and they march toward the capital. And as they march toward the capital, the other groups are going to be like, oh, these are invaders. We got to fight them. And you have this conflict that it's often never ending. Philip Collier, one of the economists from the UK, has researched this phenomenon. And he said that about 7 years or 7 to 14 years, that a conflict will be lasting for. So once it starts, it's going to be cyclical, and it can regenerate into a civil war that can be regional as well. So that's kind of how it manifests. So here are some of the countries that have challenges over resource costs. Nigeria is one on top because oil wealth has not led to a general increase in quality of life for most Nigerians outside those in the upper cadres of the Nigerian society. Matter of fact, it's generated a lot of dissent and feelings of grievances that have led to secessionist movement as well as extreme religious politics within the Nigerian space. Now, Nigeria still has done well in many regards, and it's probably the most visible African country outside as a result of the entrepreneurship and tenacity and grit of its people. But most of the Nigerian billionaires are not oil men. The oil men tend to be political leaders. So it shows us that there is talent within the society. They're able to develop despite of or in spite of resources that are leaving them behind, that they are excluded from. Angola is one in which the oil wealth led to civil war, mostly by diamonds, and as well as a consequence of the Cold War. So it's a long story, but the gist from the perspective of resource cuts is that Angolan quality of life is so expensive, so hard to access for majority of Angolians. But for those in the political class, they're living a very good life. In fact, at one point in the 2000s, maybe early 2010s, Angola, Luanda, the capital, was the most expensive city to live in the world, proper. So there's money in Angola, and not everybody has access to that money. DRC is kind of like the poster child of conflict that are linked with resources, and DRC's abundant minerals, including cobalt, gold, diamonds, everything, has kind of made it a place in which conflicts emerge internally and externally, regionally, within ethnic groups, within religious groups. It's just kind of like a very bad case of mismanagement and limited governance that has made the DRC incapable of benefiting from its resources. Now, yes, so I've highlighted some of the case studies and how the resource conflict manifests. What hasn't been touched on is that there's a limit to this theory because it doesn't explain anything. Just the presence of a resource does not mean there's going to be conflict. There's not going to be the inability of the society to exploit these resources. As a matter of fact, these resources should be beneficial to the countries that have them. So not all countries that are rich in resources suffer the resource curse. A lot of countries have resources and uh, they've done very well. And one of them is Botswana, that has like one of the biggest diamond mines in the world, and it has never suffered from a resource curse. Tanzania is another one that has natural gas. It's never suffered from a resource curse. So resource cuts manifest when institutions are weak or when the national nation building exercise has failed. And that's kind of the research of some people like Lindbergh and Angela Gappa, who have done a lot of work in regard to that, to this, and suggested that this idea of a resource curse is a myth and is perpetuated sometimes by Hollywood or by a very negative view of the African space, and kind of like suggesting that African countries require people to look over them to manage their resources, which is kind of like, if you think about it, a little colonial. Like, we need people to govern resources in Africa because they can, right? So yes, there are cases of resource curses, but most cases are not resource curses. So how do you move forward from resource costs? You want to focus on managing revenues wisely for our development and for diversification. And that requires an institutional framework that can capture excesses of resource costs or when they are about to appear. Now, the other is population boom, which I kind of hinted. Like I think it's understated how much Africa is going to be impactful in the world in the coming year. It's already 17% of the world's population. As we move forward, it's going to be 25%, sometimes up to 30 in the next 100 years or so. So the world is going to be majority African, right? But the question we want to have is which kind of an African? The begging one, the one without agency, or the powerful African that is all over your screen, all over your life, surrounding you, and in every space you occupy in the world. Those two images of Africa can contrast. But this rapid population growth, as of now, brings a lot of challenges to the continent in Africa, to the continent and the countries that are kind of recovering from post-colonialism. So one of the advantages of this population boom with demographic dividend, which is a lot of people that are working age that gain money, and this money can then be invested into society for the benefits of the future. But it also means innovation, which means that you can have larger population, create a big pool of talent, smart people, intellectuals, engineers, creatives, and all kind of people that society can leverage for their own benefit. So that's the benefit, as well as a bigger economy for everybody, which we have seen from example of China. When channeled very well, can be very useful for any society proper, right? But now we also know that population boom comes with challenges, and one of the most important challenges is in an environment in which resource scarcity is such a problem. So we have challenges for food, water, sanitation, and many other things that a larger population creates pressure for. So with regards to some readiness for that, you're most likely to see, if there's no change, high youth unemployment as a result of limited opportunity for young people. This youth employment can lead to youth unrest. So here we're going to study the Arab world as an example in which a population boom led to political limited opportunities for young people that led to the Arab Springs of 2010, 2011, that in some cases, like in the case of Syria or Libya, haven't recovered from. So a population boom is an advantage, but it also causes a lot of pressure for society with regard to issues such as climate change and things like that. But it's a very difficult one to have. It's just like for a conversation to have, one in which it's very personal and intimate, and positions about this range from different people to different people, religious affiliations and moral persuasions. Because who it is to tell somebody like, hey man, you can't have babies. It's difficult to have that. But also at the same time, who it is to tell you that you need to have babies. All right. We are learning from the United States that this is a very difficult and private matter. Now, there are, in addition to population challenge, we have a problem of governance challenge. And the governance challenge is that other issues such as population, issues such as resource costs, and limited uh, benefit of population economic growth are all wrapped around one factor, which is governance challenge, which the African continent is rich with resources, yet it struggles with regards to development. There's incremental growth in all aspects, as I've highlighted, but for a majority of the African space, this idea of development, an all-inclusive development that uplifts the quality of life, as well as the other things such as how society thinks. Modernity is kind of material. Like you can see material modernity with regards to infrastructure, housing, roads, whatever. But another aspect of modernity is ideational modernity, like the idea of people starts to change as regards to certain issues that could be sexism, racism, ethnic differences, religious extremism. That kind of modernity is difficult one. But even if we focus on the first one, which is structural changes, then if the African space hasn't realized that as well. So one of the ways to think about it is this: the weak institutional gap with regard to governance is so big in African space compared to other areas. And that those institutions have to be modified. They have to be rectified. And they can be rectified through a big debate. Other people have thought, well, maybe a strong authoritarian leaders is necessary, so which is the China route, and the others like you need a strong liberal democracy, which is the Western route. Well, in the absence of these institution frameworks, then you have a position in which the governance challenge leads to civil conflict. which result out of resource competition and instability, that's not really great for any society proper. So the African space is one which is we struggle with debates on where to go. And in my personal perception is that the only way to go, perhaps the only way that has been seen in the last 100 years, is inclusive systems that require inclusive economic and structural institutions. So now, I want you to think about the documentary that which is called "Oil Promises: How Oil Changed a Country." LK Sase and Ibele Oko did this for DW, and I had you to watch it. And it talks about Ghana and how it's like a pulse of energy, pulsating energy in the Ghanaian space about oil in the early 2000s. And as this oil machine starts to grind, the Ghanaian population realized that it's just a charade. It's not going to change the society as well. And now we see Ghana, which has done very well and has escaped the oil scarce. But oil is not really a mover within the Ghanaian economy. So I want to feel hear what you guys would think about this regard, this idea of oil and development, and whether it is useful or whether the country should abandon it altogether. The other thing I wanted you to think about is this idea of connection between true development, as in inclusive development, versus rapid development that comes out of authoritarianism, and how authoritarian regimes can validate their success on the account of economic gains that they give to society. But those kind of gains are short term and often end up negatively. So the last one is kind of interesting to think about, but in general, really what I wanted you guys to have debate on is how much extractive resources are important for African space and whether authoritarian regimes can yield development for any country. Thank you all for tuning in, and I appreciate you for your class and uh, your attentiveness, and I hope that we will meet again next week and talk more about this stuff. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.